Hi, Stephen. It's an honor to interview with you, sir. Can you introduce yourself to our audience first?
Well, thank you, Michael. My name is Steve Yates. It's an honor to join you and to engage in a good conversation today. I was Vice President Dick Cheney's Deputy National Security Advisor 20-something years ago in the Bush administration. He and I have different politics and policy these days. We might talk a little bit about that. But that was my first time working in the White House and dealing with things East Asia, Northeast Asia, Korea included. And I have since been in American politics. I was the chairman of the Idaho Republican Party for 2 terms and a member of the RNC, but I have recently worked at the America First Policy Institute and last fall moved to the Heritage Foundation where I'm a senior research fellow.
So when President Trump entered to the political world, were you on board immediately, or did it take you some time to join in?
Well, I was very, very interested immediately, but I was the chairman of a state party at the time, and so my job was somewhat to maintain neutrality during the primary, but I had the opportunity to meet with representatives of all the campaigns. And was very, very interested in the Trump campaign. They had a representative guy named Alan Cobb, who was a good friend and a nice guy, and he came to Idaho and participated in some of our events, and had some friends that were a part of the campaign policy apparatus. But I had chosen at the time to step down as chairman of the Republican Party and run for lieutenant governor in Idaho. And so I stayed in Idaho instead of getting involved in the transition and the first Trump term.
I'm only asking you this because you did enter into the political world
Correct.
Under Dick Cheney.
No, it's totally allowed.
And Dick Cheney, I think a lot of conservatives were excited about him back then,
Right.
in the 2000s, when George W. Bush came in 43. I remember he emphasized compassionate conservatism.
That was Bush, yes.
That worked well, and I think he was pretty popular among the conservatives, but I think things changed during the Iraq War, and especially I think regarding Dick Cheney with his Halliburton involvement, and also a lot of casualties that happened to Americans, even regarding 9/11. I think Americans, I remember it, because I was a huge supporter of George W. Bush back then, I was, and everybody was angry, and Afghanistan was too easy of a target, I would think, so the anger was still there for a lot of Americans, so the next target was, and a lot of Democrats were on board, even New York Times, WAPO, these left-wing media outlets were on board. We got to attack an undercountry, and that happened to be Iraq, and now it seems like a lot of Americans view that as a mistake. I do too. And President Trump, I think he was against it way back.
He was.
And he talks about this, and I think many Americans probably weren't confident about Trump being elected in the first go around because of this issue, because people were wondering whether he's making a division between conservatives, who were supporting the war and who were against. What do you think about? What did you think about Trump when he really went after? He really did went after George W. Bush, even calling him one of the worst presidents for bringing the war against Iraq, and also his view about Dick Cheney and also his daughter Liz Cheney, who I can't stand her anymore. I really do. She's one of the worst. I can say that. What's your thought about this?
So I have some mixed feelings on these things, but broadly speaking, when I worked for Vice President Cheney, I was relatively young. He is the most experienced vice president we have ever had and probably ever will have.
Vice president,
and there were some things that were very, very important to me. I mean, first and foremost, on China policy, he gave me an opportunity to push very hard on the inside of the Bush administration for a much more cautious approach to China than the pro-engagement part that ended up, I think, leading the way. Especially in the second term of the Bush administration. There's no question we could have an entire program dedicated to talking about what was the run-up to the Iraq War, what was right, what was wrong. I mean, just in life, I don't believe things are 100% right
The
or
UN
wrong.
resolution thing, right? That
Yeah.
violating that.
So, I mean, to me, I believe very, very much Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. He deserved to be eliminated. Do we need to go to war to eliminate him? That might be debatable. I also think you should never go to war with only one justification. That when you do something that risky, that there needs to be really solid ground in multiple areas for doing that. And it really fell into this WMD justification. I was not a part of the intelligence case, the public relations and diplomatic case for the war.
I distrusted the intelligence after that when they said WMD.
So I have a friend who has a beautiful, beautiful condo in New York City. And when you walk into the lobby, from a distance, it has this beautiful piece of art. And it looks modern. I'm not a good judge of modern art, but he's talking about it. And the closer you get to the art, you realize it's made out of garbage. It's stuff from the landfill, like shoes and toothbrushes and flip-flops and other kinds of things. And I felt like the intelligence picture on WMD was a little bit like that. When you put the collage together and you stood back, there were these connections your mind would make. And those might be reasonable assumptions under some circumstances, but the closer you got to it, you would see the gaps. And I never really felt like there was a need to justify why Saddam Hussein needed to be eliminated. But I did think that there was this risk of this case for war. But more than that, I thought, frankly, what Don Rumsfeld organized in shock and awe did a tremendous blow to the Iraqi National Guard at the time. Frankly, that part was successful in terms of hitting back against a country that was against America, against a leader who was trying to assassinate the president. But the occupation stuff never sat well with me or with a lot of people that I knew. And it's that part. And I don't know that Vice President Cheney will ever be able to articulate what his role was or wasn't in that. But surely he got branded with that. And then the things that we did in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, it was a crisis mentality. And so the putting up of the Homeland Security Department, having the Patriot Act go aggressively.
I'm against that. You know,
right.
At that time I was for, but
Right.
many things I'm against
But
now.
it just in life and in business, you go 10 years from something, you should be evaluating what do we know now that we didn't know then. You should never assume things done in crisis were 100% right. And whether it's China coming into the World Trade Organization, elements of the Patriot Act, and even fairly looking back, whether you agreed or disagreed at the time of the Iraq War, you can look back in retrospect and say, the justifications for this didn't hold up over time. This was immensely costly over a long period of time. Strategically, loss of life, resources. You should be able, after the passage of time, to reevaluate these things. And Donald Trump has a unique way of, he will definitely get under the skin of his counterparts.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And it's part of what he does. It's Trump being Trump. And he uses it to his advantage and now our advantage. He's doing it with leaders in Europe. He's doing it with Zelensky in Ukraine. He will do it with other leaders too. He did it with the leader of North Korea when he wanted to have dialogue, but he called him Little Rocket Man, talked about how his button was bigger than Little Rocket Man's button. This is what he does. But he did it to Vice President Cheney, and the Cheney family didn't take it well. Now, my view is I completely disagree with where Liz Cheney went on politics. I don't understand how she went so far in a different direction. I'm grateful to the Cheney family for the opportunity I was given as a young man in national security to have a very senior job and a first row seat to history at that time. But he told me some blunt things and not just to me. He's like, I pay you to give me advice, and I'm under no obligation to take it.
Did Trump say that too?
No, that's what Cheney said
said
at the time. As a young man, it kind of hurt my feelings, but I understand it more now. But just because I worked for you, I'm under no obligation to follow your politics, and I don't. at this point. So through the 2016 campaign, I was a surrogate for the Trump campaign going into the National Convention. I worked on behalf of the Trump campaign on the National Platform Committee. I believed what he was doing to reform our institutions and reorient our policy. I strongly support the coalition that he uniquely has brought together to change what has broadly been called the uniparty or fight the establishment. I mean, these things are necessary. And what DOGE is doing now, absolutely vital to America being able to revitalize itself, defend itself, be a reliable ally to our true allies around the world. I mean, all these things are so incredibly necessary. And frankly, I think that the establishment wing, whether it was neoconservatives or others, they have risked American power. And fundamentally, that's the part I don't understand. Vice President Cheney spoke so eloquently about how long and hard it is to build up power and how quickly it can be lost. He seemed to really understand the elements of power with the presidency, with America's power abroad. And it's actually a lot of that risked getting lost or compromised in the wake of the Iraq War and the fight with Trump. And so, I hear what you're saying. I feel and agree with some of that too myself. And frankly, this is the first time I've talked publicly about some of those things. But really, I feel very, very strongly about supporting President Trump, Vice President Vance, the team they've assembled, and pushing very hard for them to be able to succeed in this moment.
Both the dad Cheney and the daughter Cheney, they both endorsed Kamala, right?
I know. I can't stomach that. So, I mean, I was a chairman of the party at the state level and a member of the RNC, and I just feel like if you have benefited personally so much from going through primary processes where everyone that works in politics, if you're in the party, you get through the primary, the party's supposed to fall in line and respect the will of Republican voters and support our nominee. And 3 cycles, President Trump came through and was our nominee. And if you are a stalwart member of the party, you work, you volunteer, you respect the will of the voters, you support our brand, and you definitely oppose the opposition. I can't believe that there are people who called themselves conservative that endorsed and supported Hillary. I can't believe there are people who called themselves conservatives, endorsed and supported Joe Biden. I can't believe there are people who called themselves conservative and endorsed and supported Kamala Harris. 3 completely unjustifiable and disastrous people for America's national interests from my point of view. So whatever your hurt feelings were about bad names being called your way. Look, when I was chairman of the Republican Party in Idaho, I got slandered and sued and called all kinds of things. It comes with the territory. But there was nothing someone could do to me to make me willing to support Hillary, Biden, and the John Kerry agenda.
Their ideology all changed.
Ideologies all changed, and the policies they were for were just disastrous for America. Would hurt our families and communities. And for me, it was personal too. I mean, the open borders policies of the Biden-Harris administration that really Obama and the team that he supported were willing to kind of open the door and let those floodgates go. They hurt my family profoundly. My daughter was killed by fentanyl poisoning, and that tragedy that tragedy's hit hundreds of thousands of American families. They might have been hurt without the open borders. We have to acknowledge that's possible, but there's also no question the open borders policy really enabled the cartels to move immense amount of product, and hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed in the 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration. How can someone like the Cheney family endorse those candidates over Trump when we have real casualties in America?
I was wondering whether it was more about protecting the establishment brand or whether it's just pure hatred towards Trump, or a little bit of both.
Well, human beings can be at risk for being a little bit overly personal about these things. And I didn't like being called names and attacked when I was in politics either. But you have to at least step back and be a patriot and realize that our country is at risk. And we need to have the best athletes on the field that are going to protect our country. And they might have had a different point of view about foreign policy and national security with regard to President Trump. They're free to have their opinion, but I just could not abide the endorsement of these politicians that I think were verifiably hurting America, hurting our families. I mean, the extent that COVID lockdowns were used in the Biden administration to go after religious organizations, go against public activity, shut down our schools for extended periods of time, taking a generation of Americans kind of out of work and education has disastrous consequences for competing with China and others. So to me, just completely on the other side, and I suspect you and your audience likely were too.
Sure. Did you just say that your daughter died because of fentanyl poisoning? Can you talk a little bit more about how she got addicted to fentanyl?
Yeah, well, she had been engaged in a risky lifestyle, and I had struggled for years to try to save her from drug addiction. She was an extremely strong human in that she survived all kinds of things she should not have had to survive, but by her own choosing. But at enormous expense and risk, I got her clean from heroin addiction, but she was still engaged in other behavior. She took some of these other drugs that weren't heroin, but among them was an off-market Xanax that was laced with fentanyl. That made it so that her heart stopped, her brain was deprived of oxygen. My wife and I were together in the intensive care unit for 5 days, wondering what happens with the swelling of the brain. Even if there was some resuscitation, what kind of permanent damage was there? Is there any form of recovery? After 5 days in the ICU, we made the painful decision to honor her voluntary decision to donate organs. We went through that process. We thought that she was going to pass in that. Her lungs came back and she began to breathe on her own, but it was beyond the point of any kind of care. And we had to go through 7 days of hospice waiting for her to pass. But I was blessed to be able to be in the room with her when she finally passed. But basically, it was years of struggle to try to save my daughter, like a lot of other at-risk young adults. But she survived everything and was a very stubborn, strong-willed human, but she couldn't overcome fentanyl. And one of the great ironies of that is when she was in the intensive care unit, because of illicit fentanyl, the pain medication that was put into her IV was legal medicinal fentanyl. It was something that's very hard to get your brain around. But that was what we lived through as a family.
I'm so sorry to hear that, sir. Do you blame the open border and China for what happened?
Well, very much so. Now, there are people who will attack me and attack my daughter, but she took risks that she shouldn't have taken. And I acknowledge that. But ultimately, you cannot forgive the supply side. However responsible we might be on the demand side, you cannot forgive the supply side. So the cartels are very much involved in compromising American society, security, our communities, our families, and they are the enemy. I consider them to be the delivery mechanism of this angel of death. We also cannot forgive the Chinese government for knowingly enabling the manufacture of illicit fentanyl precursors and allowing their financial institutions to launder the cartel's money. And so they are in this business. And President Trump, I thank him for very early on, the 10% tariff he put on tariff, he explicitly said they have to take action on fentanyl. And so this wasn't a structural economic tariff. This was a penalty, a stick that President Trump is using to get the Chinese government to take seriously, stop the export of illicit fentanyl precursors. And so far the Chinese haven't responded. We'll see.
the number one cause of death of youth, right? Fentanyl is
yeah,
now.
it's like age 18 to 38.
And these days, you take it once, they can just die immediately.
Right, and in certain quantities, what it does, it immediately stops the lungs, which then leads to deprivation of oxygen to the brain and cardiac arrest. So, like with my daughter, like many others, they effectively die until they can be resuscitated by Narcan or some other emergency, and the emergency medical technicians did bring her heartbeat back and got her to the emergency room. But that's what the fentanyl does, and it's so much more powerful than the others.
But what I don't understand is, as a drug manufacturer, you would like people to get hooked and keep on coming back.
But they don't have quality control. And so what it also does, it makes all of these other drugs more addictive. It increases the sensation of the high, and it makes it much more addictive. And so it actually increases their business, but kills some of their customers because they don't have perfect quality control on the dosing.
So Steve, let's change the subject a little bit. You went to South Korea last year, and a lot of Korean, especially on the conservative side, are really paying attention to it now.
Yeah.
The story that you and also I think Fred also went
Fred's
to South
a very,
Korea.
very good friend, and you'll be talking to him soon.
And I understand that you met with lawyer Park Ju-hyun, who is also the leading lawyer who studies about election fraud.
Right.
Can you talk about your trip of last year to South Korea for our audience?
Well, Fred and I went to talk about a book that he helped organize at the America First Policy Institute. I was affiliated then too, and helped contribute to some of the content of the book, but Fred really organized. It was an America First approach to national security. And so we were going to allied capitals to talk about the book because a lot of our allies and friends overseas, they only get what the mainstream American media is saying, and they completely misconstrue the America First movement, President Trump and his policies, and especially on national security. So Fred and I were talking with people in government and politics and the media to try to explain what the America First movement is about, what the policy agenda really is, and with a real focus on national security. And so we collaborated a ton on things that were Japan, Korea, China, and trying to talk about and Taiwan, where these issues were at play. We did talk with a lawyer.
Not just South Korea, it was Japan and Taiwan.
Well, we had gone to Japan and Taiwan in a separate trip, and then we wanted to be able to cover Seoul as well as a very, very important of the conservative ecosystem, but also our allies. We did meet with a lawyer. I had been in electoral politics and was sort of sensitive to what some of the election system issues might be, but this was sort of fact-finding and a learning experience. Neither of us were experts on what was happening in Korea, but we definitely had open minds to listen to what were some of the questions and allegations.
So it was more about learning Korean election system. Okay.
Yes. So that's kind of what that conversation was really about. Fact-finding, educational for us, listening to people who have similar ideologies and political outlooks express what their concerns were. And at the America First Policy Institute, there was an election integrity part of the enterprise that wanted to look at making it easy to vote, hard to cheat, and lots of work. And so our friends in Korea were looking at what could be learned from the AFPI work on election integrity, and what could we learn from what the Korean experience was. But we weren't there to judge what was happening in Korea. We were just there for a short visit to learn.
Did you see anything alarming with all the reports that you were getting? Because I think South Korea, the conservatives, the number one issue for them is election integrity right now.
Well, I would just give the caveat that we were in no position to judge the facts. We also were not really in the position to dismiss the facts that were being raised, but a lot of the themes that were presented in that conversation were similar to things that we had heard in our American experience. And so we thought that there was enough that was worthy of continuing the conversation, but we weren't in a position to judge whether the facts that were presented were strong, weak, overwhelming, or what have you. But we were definitely fair-minded and open-minded in listening to what concerns people were raising.
I think a lot of our audience are curious whether we have a common enemy. I think South Korea and America, I believe that it was rigged in 2020. I have no doubt about that. It has always been rigged. And I think now we're trying to fix it. So the common enemy, is it China? Is it the CCP?
Well, I would say, number one, the common enemy is the globalist movement that is hostile to our national sovereignty, hostile to our fundamental freedoms of speech, association, religion.
Smartmatic, Dominion, are we supposed to be concerned about those?
And so I also, I advocate this in the United States. I think getting back to having verifiable paper ballots with monitors and systems of integrity, you can apply technology, but you have to kind of have the bedrock of confidence in one person, one vote, and a verifiable ballot trail.
Single day,
all of that. I strongly support that, but there are exceptions for people that are deployed in the military and things like that. But I think overwhelmingly, I look at Taiwan, where I've spent decades of advocacy for democratic expansion. They're able to count millions of votes in under one day, all on one day, all paper ballot. People show an identification card. And there's very limited disputes, and so I strongly encourage that model as a way forward, and I hope that people will move in that direction.
How did Taiwan convince the public to go into that direction?
In some ways they've done it from the beginning.
Are they smarter people?
There's sort of a combination in life of intelligence and dumb luck, and sometimes we get lucky, and sometimes we make smart choices, but if it's the right result, good. But Taiwan from the beginning, I think because of the opposition movement and the need to engender trust, when democracy bloomed in Taiwan, President Lee Teng-hui was a unique figure in that he was raised Japanese, was ethnically Taiwanese. He was the KMT chair and president of the country, but he had a real heart for all the Taiwan people, and he wanted an electoral system that allowed the opposition party that became the Democratic Progressive Party to be able to legitimately contend, and he saw value in that competition for his vision for what Taiwan could become. So I think that Taiwan was blessed by a unique leader at that time opening democracy. And hopefully Korea will have that kind of a leader to move in that direction too.
So nobody talked a public figure openly talked about voter fraud until President Yoon declared martial law, and I bet you know the story about martial law. Now he's arrested and facing impeachment, in the Constitutional Court, which I think the final decision will come out early March, mid-March. A lot of conservatives in Korea, they're devastated. They're so worried about it. But do you think, is there like a silver lining here that at least President Yoon opened the conversation and now we are paying attention to this cause? Is that the first step towards the righteous direction?
Whatever happens with President Yoon, the person, and it's extremely difficult for me as an American watching from far away to truly understand what is happening and why it's happening. But regardless of what happens to him, I would just encourage all conservatives in Korea to learn the lesson that the Make America Great Again movement has, and the broader coalition with Maha and others in joining it. Of course, we support and respect President Trump, and he has been through things that nobody leader in the world ever has.
Only he could have done all this,
At the same time, I think he'd be the first to say the movement is more than one man. And I'm certain he wants the movement to go beyond his time in government and his time on earth. I think he sees this as an investment in American revival and America's future. And so if Korean conservatives have been shocked by this, hopefully it shocks them into activism, building coalitions, working on the electoral system, but also working to win, to come back in, to make Korea great again.
Yes.
And so regardless of what happens with the man, the movement needs to be bigger. And if we do that, then the future is brighter for our allies in Korea and the better angels in America too. And that's my hope.
Stephen, where can our audience see your work?
Well, they're welcome to follow me on X at YatesComms, YATESCOMMS, and also at the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. And I just look forward to continuing the conversation, and I'm grateful for what you and your audience does.
Thank you, Stephen. We would like to see you back in Korea.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.